Welcome to another episode of Fight the Burnout. Today we have Dr. Kareem. Whoop, my computer just went crazy. Dr. Kareem Puranda. He is ex-law enforcement and now does counseling. He's an author, speaker, a community advocate, all sorts of different things. As usual, we'll let him take it away in just a second. I do want to remind you, take one thing away from today. We're going to give you a whole bunch of information, a whole bunch of different tools, tricks, tips, stories, but just take one thing away and start actually putting it into action. I talk to many people, coach lots of different people, and the biggest struggle that people have is actually putting things into action. So if you do need assistance, reach out to us. Go to createfromwhy.com, hit that contact us button, and hit us with a message. But most importantly, just whatever resonates with you the most today, start just reminding yourself every day of it. Start putting that into action, into play of your life every single day, and you'll see a complete change in a year's time. We are sponsored by Create From Why, which is running a motorcycle retreat to better yourself, network with business professionals and other people. We have border patrol officers, we have business entrepreneurs, we have my mentor is coming along, who helps people build masterminds to bring in another form of revenue. And we have a slew of different people. Plus, it looks like Kyle Chandler, the actor, is going to come join us as well, should he not be filming. So it's a very cool event. If you want to learn more about that, go to motorcyclemastermind.com, and we will have a conversation more about that. So without further ado, Kareem, why don't you take it away? Tell us about who you are, what you do, and how you got to where you are right now.
Appreciate that. Well, my name is Dr. Kareem Puranda, and I am a licensed clinical mental health counselor. I own and operate a private practice called Self-Talk Counseling and Consulting. And what I do, basically, I take people from caterpillar to butterfly in a change process. I like to call it the chrysalis. Counseling is the chrysalis that helps people to transform. And I teach people how to manage life on life terms. I became a therapist, quite interestingly. You talked about me being a former cop. I became a therapist because I made a poor decision. I didn't manage my mental health properly when I was in the profession. And Dr. Puranda is a byproduct of Officer Puranda, who ended up in a jail cell behind 2 indictments on using excessive force under the color of law. And all of it was a culmination that stemmed from burnout. And when I sat in that jail cell, I had a come to Jesus moment where I had to reflect back on my life and figure out, how did I end up after an 8-year career in law enforcement, how did I end up in that predicament when I was desirous of becoming a top cop? And what I discovered was my ego betrayed me. And the ego I was using, not in law enforcement, but an ego that predated law enforcement, even growing up in Bronx, New York, was established to keep myself safe, but it also kept me stuck in a mindset that wasn't appropriate throughout my career. I worked all the high-risk units. I was on the gang unit, the street drug and addiction unit. I was on the special response team, or the equivalent SWAT team. And we worked zero tolerance task force stuff. And so we worked in all the areas where there was high crime, drugs, shootings, violent assaults. And, when you work those kind of communities or those districts, your mind stays on go mode. And it was just, for me, it was fitting and perfect because I grew up in a neighborhood where I was always on go, where high crime, high poverty equals high crime. And you had to be cautious everywhere you went so that you didn't get caught lacking, as they say in some of these communities, so that you don't become the prey to the predators, if you will. So that's long and short of how I ended up in this particular position.
I love that. I love that.
I couldn't have written that script any better than the way it happened.
Yeah, no, it's there's gonna be some good stuff out of today. Before we dive into some of your past and your background and getting to where you are now and what you do, I always like to ask what your definition of burnout is, because I know there's the Webster dictionary and that, but there's, everybody kind of feels it's a little bit different. What would you say your definition of burnout for yourself is?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I did not know what burnout was until I left the profession. When I was in the profession, there was this feeling that I could not express. And I'm gonna tell you what's crazy about it, Chris. This tattoo I got on my arm, I got it in my early 20s. It's a barbed wire. I got a tattoo around my neck with a chain and a lock, right? And I remembered in that moment when I got these tats in around the same time in my early 20s, that it was an indescribable feeling, is what I understood them to be. I just couldn't put my finger on it, but all of it was burnout. All of it was the real version of me being trapped behind an ego that says the real version of me wasn't adequate enough, but the ego is. And the ego was the big bad, 400-pound bench presser that I was back then. That's who the ego was. And that was more comfortable to have on Front Street. So for me, burnout was the exhaustion of the real me not having the bandwidth or the space to perform and be free. It was that struggle with the ego and the real version of me. Burnout was a byproduct of that struggle where the ego won, but ended up costing me so much. I lost my job and I lost so much more with the ego than I gained with it, which is why now today I don't operate in it. And now I'm so free, burnout free, all that jazz, because I'm now operating in the authentic self.
It's funny when you actually fall in and you actually know what your needs are, what your wants are, who you actually are.
Yeah.
You actually feel so much more energized, don't you? And you get so much more
Yes.
done, and you actually are accomplishing way more than the ego side of you does, and you're accomplishing all the side that the ego side would anyways. It's
Bingo.
it's so amazing. I call it making sure what you do serves you instead of you serving it.
Oh, come on, man. That's well said. Yes. Yes.
So, wrapping up, and I love the fact of the tattoo. I've got my whole sleeve is done with animals from like New Zealand and the US, but I've got a dark wolf on my shoulder. And it's interesting you said about the tattoos and getting them when you were actually in that kind of where you felt trapped, where you felt that
Yeah.
kind of that burnout kind of was happening, and you recognize it now. I was sitting in the gym, I don't know, about 6-12 months ago, and I looked over in the gym at the mirror and I saw the wolf. And I was like, holy crap. And that dawned on me. I got the wolf when I was in the darkest stages of my burnout.
Wow.
I actually wanted a white wolf on there with the blue eyes, that you see those cool
Yeah.
photos of them and that. And the tattoo artist is like, it's not going to line up with the rest of it. Plus, also the white will fade really quickly with your fair skin and that. And I was like, okay, we'll go the dark wolf. Now I realize why I needed the dark wolf, because the dark
Wow.
wolf is that negative voice, is that burnout that was happening at the time. And now it's a reminder to me of he's not in control of me. I listen to him, I acknowledge him, and we move through it together.
There
And
you
it's
go.
it's so interesting how we get those tattoos and they mean stuff that we didn't even know that they meant at the
The
time.
narrative. Yeah, no doubt.
It's amazing. All right, let's go back into, obviously you said, your upbringing led you into, you were in that ego kind of state. Tell us a little bit about how that ego state benefited you throughout the career. Obviously, we know how it was destructive. You said you went into use of force, which we'll get into. How it benefited you to actually be the good cop that you were when you were that great cop.
Yeah. So the ego for me was really interesting, right? Because it's not about the ego of me being better than you or any better than anybody. It was more of a defense mechanism to mask whatever I at the time in those stages that I was growing up through, being able to mask the vulnerabilities that I thought the real me possessed, the vulnerable side of me possessed. And it wasn't that I was vulnerable or inadequate in any way. It was just that the environment I grew up in didn't make it safe to be who you truly were. Anybody that was inconsistent with the narrative of that community was considered lame, awkward, or a standout, and then they were attacked for being different, if you will. So I learned to be a predator because I didn't want to be the prey. And so that's where the ego started to manifest itself now. My thing was growing up with a single parent. My mother was from Jamaica. And so she was an immigrant to the US, and she didn't really know much about US customs. But I grew up in the Bronx. I was born in the Bronx, and the Bronx wasn't friendly. I would say that New York was not friendly, man. And it was rough. Back in the 80s and the 90s, the Bronx was like a war zone, man, with a lot of gun violence and things like that. And so you had to learn how to survive. You're right. So you're in survival mode when you're walking to and from school on a regular basis. And it's like a generational thing. It's like you had these older folks that was involved in crime, and they were having kids, and their kids grew up in the same kind of element, and they sort of kind of like a family tradition, if you will, in most cases in certain neighborhoods. And so when in Rome, you do as Rome does. You do what they do, and you follow along just so that you wouldn't be victimized. And so my biggest thing, my biggest heartbreak, this is where my ego started ultimately, was the heartbreak associated with not having my father in my life. I thought that by his absence, I had low self-worth. I wasn't valuable. And so my ego focused on not only protecting me from the dangers in the environment, but also going after accolades, going after achievements to make up for the low value or self-worth that I was lacking by acquiring something that was worth being celebrated or valued. And so for me, it wasn't about materialistic gain as much as it was more about getting acknowledgement for lifting the most weights or doing this amazing thing or knocking these people out or having a good fight game. That was what the ego prided itself on going after, so that I could find a way to make up for the value that I thought was lacking because my father didn't invest in me in the way that I thought he should. And
Yeah.
so that followed me all the way into my adulthood, even into law enforcement, where my mind was always seeking things to do that would provide me accolades. And I never stayed still. I used to let my wounds, my emotional wounds, drip dry. I never tended to them. I never looked at them. I just kept moving to the next thing. And that's how I stayed busy. Always to find out, Chris, that, man, it was a dead end.
Yep.
Gosh, I thought this was going to be the thing that was fulfilling, and it's not. Okay, what's next? Let me find something else to do. And then that's how my burnout ended up also piggybacking off of that stuff.
Yeah, no, it's so true. I coach a lot of people to get into the police force, and a lot of them. Actually, before I go into that, I want to know what from that. Was it crime stuff, or was it just the lifting the weights, that when you were young and in the Bronx?
Oh man, no. We listen. There's some things that I'm not proud of that I've done, man. I've had a ton of. I was left back twice in the 10th grade for fighting in school. Got expelled from one school, sent to the what they call the second worst high school in the Bronx back in the 90s. And I got left back there again for suspensions and whatnot. And then something clicked in me. What was my saving grace was football. I
Uh,
found something else to devote my energy to. I was an all-star running back, all-city running back. Ended up getting a scholarship, a partial scholarship to play ball at a Division II HBCU here in Salisbury, North Carolina, and that's how I left New York. And that was my ego shifted to that. So it went from fighting people in the streets and helping people out, beat people up, and all this other stuff. It shifted from that to the gridiron, where I was able to take my aggression out on the field instead of people. And then that sort of kind of stabilized me. And I needed football to keep me stable, if
yeah,
you will. And that's what sort of kind of set me straight, because I didn't know what was wrong with me. It was normal to be that way in my neighborhood. So
yeah,
I didn't have any reason to look at it as anything other than this is just what we do. And so the norm, the idea of toxicity being the norm, it's the biggest irrational thinking that I could ever imagine. I'm looking back on my life, like I can't even say that I was so stupid. It was more so that was my best thinking, because I had nothing to counter it. And
yeah.
so I didn't know what I didn't know,
We had
and
no, you had no, and again, there's a lot of stuff that I've been seeing the last couple of years, especially. I don't know, I'd probably just focus on it more around the whole research around young males, especially without a father figure,
yeah,
and the paths that they take end up, a lot of times it goes down that crime path because they're always trying to fill that gap or that void
yeah,
that they have no. So they're like, oh, I've got to do this, and I've got to be the man of the house and the macho person, and again, like you said, be that kind of ego driven, kind of toxic masculine guy that
yes,
we're
yes,
hearing more and more about, because they have nobody to bounce themselves off of. And it doesn't have to be that the father is actually absent, like not even there. It can actually be that the father just is not there emotionally, physically, mentally for the kids. um
exactly.
uh so you got into gridiron, into football. which I know so many people that get into that. They're just like, yeah, I get to take my anger out on the field now, and it's actually safe and legal. Uh,
Yep.
and then I take it from there. At some point, it went, yeah, that kind of focus ended up getting into law enforcement. When did you decide you wanted to become a police officer?
Great question. So that was my senior year in college. I'm trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I write about this in my book, the notion that I had three options. I could either become a teacher because I enjoyed like educating people about things or working with kids, but I didn't want to be confined to a classroom. Then the other option was a social worker. At that time, the ego says, "No, that's a feminine profession. I'm too masculine for that." And look what I'm doing today, right? So I ain't doing that. The ego, and then law enforcement. Oh man, I could mentor kids and kick ass at the same time. Law enforcement it is. And that was all ego driven. I was more desirous of helping my community in all actuality, but the ego got the best of me, especially being an African American officer going to patrol a predominantly African American neighborhood. I was often viewed as a sellout, a traitor, and all these negative things before I could even be able to open my mouth to help. So people were stiff arming, I mean, like Heisman Trophy stiff arming me before I could even render aid. And that also added to the frustration of, you know what? All right, if this is how we're gonna play the game, I know how to be an asshole. Since y'all want to be an asshole, I know how to be one too. And then that's where I became that badass cop that ended up with all these use of forces.
Yeah, no, I can totally understand that one. I've got so many questions, man. So many. Like this is amazing. This is such a great conversation. What were you trying by joining the police? What were you trying to overcome or change, or you could even go as deep as saying fix?
Yeah. So in the beginning, what inspired me to become a cop, in addition to the rationalization of kicking ass and mentoring kids, there was a police chief at that particular time who was also an adjunct professor at the school I attended. He was African American. He was my first example of an African American male in a powerful role that I had access to. I never had access to anyone that was in such an affluent role. And he impressed me. He was really inspirational to me. And I said, one day I would love to be like that, right? But again, ego going after the value of things, right? I just didn't know it back then. I'm just in retrospect articulating it, but that's what the ego wanted. And so he told me what I needed to do to become a police officer, and I checked all the boxes, and I became a police officer. At that time, the agency was about 120 officers or so, and I would say on one hand, six maybe were African American. Most other people were, Caucasian, and all the African American officers were spread out into different districts or different rotations. So it was just like one to each unit type of thing, and that was their multicultural acknowledgement of diversity and all that jazz. And where they put me when I was first hired was in the community that had the largest African American population. They figured, well, hey, you can't get in trouble for arresting them, but we can. So hey, why not put you out there and let you handle those folks and their problems, right? Not realizing I was gonna get the stiff arm that they was giving me out there the way that they handled me.
Actually, probably worse.
You feel me? And so, so my goal to try to be an example to the community as a representation of a good cop quickly got snuffed out because of the rejection that I experienced. And then the ego says, see, this is why you can't be nice. Just just be that, take no excuses, kick ass, take names tomorrow, be that kind of guy. And there were people in the department, my FTOs, those veteran officers, that sort of kind of indoctrinated me to the culture, the subculture of the agency. Hey, as soon as I left BLET, basic law enforcement training, hey, forget what you learned in training. We're going to teach you how to do real policing out here. They told me which supervisors to avoid, which people to avoid in the agency. And so they sort of kind of started skewing my perspective on how the job goes. Yeah. In my field training experience, Chris, they wanted to see whether or not I could fight. Now, for the most part, right, when I went into the profession, I graduated top of my class in criminal justice from school. So all they understood was that I was a book smart guy and I was black, and they wanted to see if I could fight.
And
right?
you're
They
probably
thought
pretty
that
decent
become,
sized because it looks like you got some size on you now. So
oh
you
yeah, yeah,
definitely
yeah,
would have it had
yeah.
size back
I
in
was
your
always
20s.
swole, right? And so I don't know what they was thinking because they didn't know my background. They didn't know where I come from. I love to fight. Now I didn't, but not because it was who I am, it's because out of necessity to avoid becoming prey. So when they started like trying to create conditions where we're answering hot calls and going to like fights or domestics and shots fired, they want me to be the one to take point on these calls. They really want to see me get into a fight. And sure enough, they got their wish. Third phase of field training, we got checked out with a car on the side of the highway. We figured out he needed assistance. So we checked out with him and started, rolling a tow truck to his way to get, because his car broke down. Well, my FTO was on the phone with his girlfriend, and he ran the tag, and they said that the tag came back stolen. Now I didn't know what all the 10 codes were at that time, so I'm still learning what not in field training. And he said, hook him. My field trainer tells me to hook him while he's on the phone. And I'm like, hook him? No, we got a hook coming for the car. So like, what hook him were you talking about? And so he's like, no, car's tag is stolen. And I'm like, oh. And so when I looked at the guy looked at me, he took off running. I said, oh crap. And so now I'm in a foot chase and I get him. And then he started to resist. And this is another thing that came to me when I was in a jail cell. But he started to resist. And I, wham bammed him one good time and then knocked him out. And then we were able to put him in custody. And my FTO celebrated, oh, my rookie's got squabbles. My rookie, oh man, wait till everybody hears about this. And I was celebrated for what I did.
For violence, yep.
For violence, using force the way that they saw that it should have been done. Like, this is real policing, if you will. So they celebrated it. But now, fast forwarding to me sitting in that jail cell, I understood why people ran from me or why people resisted arrest all of those times. Because that jail cell sucks to sit in that jail cell, man. And I get it. I understood it wholeheartedly when I was actually behind the dang on in the cell.
It's interesting because I heard a lot of like you said, you didn't have your dad around. You were always trying to prove to yourself and to other people and be validated for things. And then all of a sudden you're in a profession where you looked up to the chief. You were like, oh my God, I want to be like him. I want a mentor as such, a father figure. And then you go into the police and you see this all the time. And I've said this, my wife and I have had conversations about this. I feel like, especially like those that grow up in like a low poverty, lower economical kind of situation and have to survive at, like you've said. And again, I don't understand it. You could call me that white privilege because I did grow up really not asking for anything. So take it as from that side. But from interviewing and talking to lots of different people about it, people end up going one of two ways. They end up going, and now that I'm out of law enforcement, I can see this because I was very much a similar thing. I was like, okay, cool, you guys are shit and you guys are good. And there was no more, no in between. But gangs, people when they're really young and they have no father figure around, want some sort of mentoring, want some sort of connection with people, want some sort of father figure in their life. And they go one of two ways a lot of the times. They either go law enforcement or something to do with law enforcement or that kind of really big side, or they swing to gangs.
Yeah.
I remember at my training, they go, welcome to the biggest gang in the world.
Yeah, many people would agree with that.
You think about it. We're on the other sides of the world. We were connected by another cop. And we instantly connect because there's that rapport of we were both ex-cops. We're both cops. So there's that. It doesn't matter anything else. It's that same exact thing. But it's interesting to listen to your story around the whole, like, it was celebrated with the violence by somebody that you would have been looking up to, that would have, and all these things. So I was like, oh, cool. I just keep doing that. And now I'm getting validated, like you said.
Bingo. I had a supervisor tell me that if you're not getting complaints, you're not doing your job. So why would I think anything different? If I've got these old school officers who we didn't have body worn cameras during my era because I worked from 2002 to 2010, but their generation, they were trying to cultivate me from their 20-year-old version self, which policing looked totally different when I got into the profession from their 20-year-old self, right? And so they meant well, but it wasn't well. It wasn't proper. It wasn't appropriate. So I didn't have an adequate mentor. And by the way, that chief that I had looked up to, while I was in basic law enforcement training, he actually resigned because of some whatever the heck was going on. So he was no longer there. He wasn't. So here I was all over again, experiencing abandonment, because I was looking forward to him being that father figure that I never had.
Yep.
And now he's gone. And so like, well, what the hell now?
Yeah.
So now, I'm looking to these senior officers who are, yeah, knockout king, Puranda punch, were some of my nicknames and whatnot. And they just weren't adequate role models during my young career.
How do you feel that the things you experienced and dealt with, because would you say like would you say that you joined the profession to counteract a lot of what had happened to you, or wanting to stop a lot of the stuff that was around and that you experienced as a child?
Yeah, one of the things was, for me, that's always been a big deal for me in my adult life, is to be the expectation that I never had, live up to the expectations of what I never had. So I am the father that I wish I had for my 4 children. I am the mentor that understands how to read through behaviors, because I never had a mentor that understood that my antics in school was just me asking for help the best way I knew how, without knowing to say, help me. I just, punch somebody. Hopefully somebody would understand that meant help me in some way, shape, or form. And I know how to read through those behaviors now, which is why I'm so effective at what I do as a therapist with the kids and even the first responders that I work with that are suffering in silence. Knowing how to read through that. To your point earlier, when you had mentioned, shooting some bullshit to the therapist, and if they don't know how to read through that, then yeah, it's a jacked up session. You know what I'm saying? Because I was one of those guys too that deflected like hell. Like, no, I'm fine, pious, happy, put on a smile, but man, I feel like shit behind it. So I was that guy as well too, and so I know how to read through those behaviors, man, because I lived it. I lived through those stages of my life.
How do you make sure, like, especially as a therapist and even being an ex-cop, I know like you and I talked, backstage before we started recording around my story, which I put on so many masks. I went to 3 different counselors. The first 2 just fed into my stuff, didn't read through that mask. I was able to, and I take fault at my own as well, not being completely honest and taking that mask off for them, probably because I didn't feel like I could.
Yes.
And where was I going? As a therapist and even as an ex-cop, maybe even as a cop, I know that you said you're able to read through things, you're able to read all that stuff. And I know, just like anything, it's a sword is double-edged for a reason. One way is good and one way,
Yes.
it can be used as evil. How do you make sure, like, for those that maybe are like, oh, I want to, I feel like I can, but, or maybe, maybe they are reading people, but they're using it for that negative aspect and not recognizing that they're doing it. How do you make sure that doesn't happen?
So I'll tell you this: growing up in a dangerous environment, or if you grew up in what I would call survival mode, you learn how to normalize people and read things. Even as a cop, like you're doing foot patrol, or you go into a beat, you normalize everything. You look at what's out of you can tell when things are out of place, if you will. One of the things I know about therapy is that people end up in therapy for a reason, and it's not because everything is going great. And so, to show up on the couch or in my office and say, no, things are fine. I have no complaints. Well, we have to evaluate the totality of the circumstances that got you into this predicament, right? And so, I'm always assessing from A to Z, hey, beginning to end, hey, what's normal and what's out of place. And also looking for incongruence and, and things that are not lining up, and being able to gently confront those things to make it make sense. Because I'm always curious about the individual, because I don't always know their background or what they've been through in terms of going through in life. So I always want to be curious and be a student of the individual that's in front of me. And so whenever I'm reading behaviors or reading through behaviors, I'm also assessing the big picture of what they do, their family structure, family backgrounds, and things that I know about them, to be able to qualify what seems sketch versus what seems, legitimate. And so I always like gently confront on things that, I'm curious to know more about. And that usually helps to break down the resistance or the anxiety or the fear that many people come into a session guarded with, because of they want to be able to trust you. They want to make sure that this space is safe. And I make sure that I try to create that kind of atmosphere for my folks.
I love that, man. I love that. Now you've experienced obviously massive burnout, ended up in a jail cell because of it.
Mm,
Um, so it is the ultimate worst case scenario. We don't like to see anybody. We're seeing on probably the media is showing us a lot more of law enforcement that are getting there. You know, I watch those videos
yeah,
and I sit there and you can see, I mean, you can probably see it as well. You watch those videos and you look into those officers' eyes or how they're acting, you're
yep,
like, yeah, he's burned out.
yep,
This is a response to being extremely burned out and feeling totally
yep,
drained. And this is how he feels like he has the power back or she has the power back.
yep.
Um, from your experience, what can officers do for themselves or for those that they see that they're like, you know, Kareem's not acting like his normal self, or he's not acting in the line of, what is a police officer? What would you say is some of the key things that can be done, one for themselves and one to help other officers to, prevent them from ending up in that jail cell?
Yeah, two things, right? It's twofold. The courage that it takes to own your truth is different from the courage it takes to run towards gunshots and stop the threat. It's a different type of courage. And having that kind of courage is necessary, which many officers don't have, which is why we lie when we go to talk to a therapist, right? Because we don't really want them to see that side of us, which, doesn't exemplify masculine strength, if you will. That's the side where we're emotionally wounded or weak or fragile. We don't want to show that. And so, I have a firm belief that the greater the vulnerability, the greater the ego, the greater the anger, the greater the hurt. That's my theory, because these are the things we're using to regain power in our powerlessness. And we don't want to show anybody that stuff. So for that officer to apply the tourniquet to himself, he's going to have to own the courage or face the fear that he created and create the courage through that fear by going through it, by challenging it, if you will. That's number one for that officer. But if we're talking about another officer supporting another officer who they witness is struggling, being able to create a safe environment. Most oftentimes police officers suffer in silence. I was one of them, simply because the environment is not safe enough to disclose that I've got a problem. I don't want you to render me unfit for duty. And in my practice, what we aim to do is, and I tell this to all the administrators that send their officers to me, that we are looking to make your officer remain fit for duty. We're not looking to get their jobs taken away from them. We want to render them fit for duty. They say an officer who knows about their stuff is in a better predicament than the one who doesn't know about his stuff or doesn't ask for the help. So we focus on it from that premise. And so far, so good. But ultimately, for a police officer to get the help that they need, it's got to be a safe space created with someone who they identify as safe. Usually a safe person is one who understands what they don't understand. If I would have met me, if I would have met Dr. Puranda some years ago, oh man, I'd have been in love with that guy, man, because he would have gotten me. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, but I couldn't have been me without first being that guy that didn't understand shit,
Yeah.
at the end of the day. So it had to work out the way that it worked out.
As you were saying that, it reminded me of when I was going through my stuff the first time and I didn't recognize what was going on. And I remember there was a female officer who I'm still in contact with. She's no longer in the job, but I remember I was struggling with my wife, and I were struggling. That's where it was showing up. It was showing up with my wife. I wasn't saying that it was showing up at work or that I was struggling at work. It was that my relationship was struggling, and I love my wife, and I'm still with her to this day because she put up with my stuff and helped me and
Wow.
just stood by
She's a
me.
strong and
She's
awesome
very
woman.
oh,
And
she's
kudos.
very strong, very awesome, and I very much appreciate her. I probably don't show her it enough half the time, but we, you know, we were struggling at home. We were talking about stuff. My wife was trying to get stuff out of me, but couldn't. I was being that ego-driven cop that was like, "Nah, I'm fine. I protect
Yep.
people." I mean, there
Yep.
was times I remember like one incident where I broke down. I was on traffic at the time, and I was like, "I'm just all I do is piss people off every day. I don't do anything good." But yet I loved that. That was probably one of my more favorite positions to have was on traffic because we got left alone. We got to drive fast. We got to do whatever we wanted all day. It was actually quite fun, and respond to whatever we wanted. But I remember talking, and I remember for some reason I sat down with this officer, and I was like, "Oh, I got stuff going on." She's like, "Oh, hey, how's it going?" And for some reason, I just verbal diarrheaed to her, and just fucking let it all out to her. I was like, "Oh, my wife and I are struggling, and this and that." And she'd known me since I first started. Come to find out, when I first started, she was struggling and everybody was taking the piss out of her, saying, oh, she's just taking the piss and she's taking time off work. And oh, now she's got a back injury. And so then they sent her to dispatch to work at the comms unit, and we're pushing her all over the place. And come to find out, when I talked to her and I told her what was going on, she's like, I went through a stage where I was struggling and I was doing this. And she's like, I went to the welfare person and I talked to them and got some counseling and got this. What did I do after that? Because I respected her for opening up to me and telling me what was going on. I first off went, who's the welfare what, who? Because I didn't actually know where it was. Yeah. But she told me, and I actually went and did it. Because again, like you said, that trust, it was like, oh, she actually somewhat gets me, and this is what she did. Okay, cool. I'll go give that a go, because I actually want to be better. I want to be the better cop. I want to be the better husband.
Right.
So I love that. I just wanted to, reinforce that with again, my story of it.
Yeah.
So if we jump to, you're in jail and you're sitting there reflecting on things.
Yeah.
Well, you've gone through a few things that, you wish you had known prior in that.
Yeah.
What did you do coming out of there? Like, what was the change that in that moment you're like, enough is enough. I'm gonna change. And what was your first step?
Yeah, well, shit, I had to get past the trial first, because we had two kids. And so it was a one hell of a journey. I was a stay-at-home dad for 2 years, between 2010 and 2012. And nobody would hire me. I mean, you talk about depression, suicidal ideation, all that stuff, man, because I did not know how to cope with this new normal that I had no control over. And so it was rough during that year. Raising my last two boys, they're twins. I tell you, it gave me a phenomenal appreciation for womanhood, because I was changing diapers, I was burping, feeding them, putting them to sleep while my wife went back to work, because I couldn't find a job because I was being investigated, and I was overqualified for jobs like the gas station and the supermarket. Heck, I went there to find a job to just do third shift stocking, and they said, "Man, you're overqualified, man. We can't hire you. You have a master's degree." Man, dude, I was like, "You gotta be kidding me." I'm like, "All right." So I said, "You know what? My wife, my superhero, she again was supportive, present, attentive to me, especially during that time I was really emotional, and I had nothing to keep the ego up. The ego it betrayed me, so I there was no reason to keep it up any longer. And so I started a spiritual journey, going to church and praying and things like that. And then I went through the trial. I was served the papers in 2012, then turned myself in 2013. January of 2013, April 20th, I want to say April 21st to the 25th, maybe, I had a 4-day trial. I had fellow police officers testify against me, saying that I used force excessively. They didn't feel like there was the appropriate usage of force. They showed the videos of where I bopped the guy and knocked him out, and they showed another video where I had body slammed another guy, and and they were trying to show a pattern of this officer is just a loose cannon and all this other stuff.
How you'd been trained.
And so here's the thing, right? In that time frame, I felt like I was doing my job according to the way that my supervisors and all of them celebrated the way that I was doing my job. So I had no reason to believe that I was doing anything wrong. And so, despite all the complaints that I've gotten, I mean, I had a portfolio of complaints and all that stuff, but they were all unfounded. They were all unfounded. So it's like, well, how did we get to this point, right? And so went through the trial, articulated, my version of the story, and I was found unanimously not guilty, because I was doing my job against actively resistant people who did not want to go to jail. These are dope dealers that had drugs on them and they ran, and all that jazz. And so we get into a fight, and I won. And so it's one of those things where I hate that I had to go through it, but it was necessary to create where I'm at today. Yeah. And so the jail cell experience, and the trial and all of that stuff taught me how the ego betrayed me. And I vowed to never resurrect him again. He's still there. And he whispers, "Hey man, what's up, man? You gonna let me come out?" No, I'm not gonna let you come out. Stay your ass down.
You listen to him, you acknowledge him, and then you make a choice on what you want to do with him.
Exactly. Right. And so I pivot and I go in the direction that I believe where I have the most guaranteed freedom. And that's just being my authentic self. And that's how we ended up here, man. I have no desire to use force or put hands on nobody ever again. And I even stopped taking martial arts. I don't lift weights for the purposes of mangling people and folding them up. It's just now just to keep myself in shape and do this good work and try to help other people not to go down the same route that I went.
I love that, man. I love the turnaround and the journey. And, I'm glad that you're found not guilty on it, but obviously it still did change everything. And as you said, it changed everything for the better. It changed everything for getting you to where you are now.
Yeah.
And I know, like, you made a comment, and I know it's been brought up quite a few times. And I'm curious on your thoughts on it to prevent this from happening to another officer, or to prevent this from getting into the media and getting police slandered even more, which, then disheartens and burns out even more officers, because when it's thrown in your face in a negative aspect, it's very hard to stay positive and that stuff as it's thrown at you all the time, especially if you love what you do. So you had that file of use of force complaints that, had no hold on anything, and they tried to use that against you. Obviously, we're finding out, you take the George Floyd incident, for example, and he had massive complaint things on him. I actually know one of his FTOs that from the very beginning, and he's actually a really good guy, and kind of, he was like, yeah, there was some red flags back then even. But people could also say the same thing about yourself. You've quote unquote looked like you like to have fights, you like to have scraps, you were good at it, you had that ego side of stuff that you openly talk about. How can we use that to help those officers shift from that burnout, shift from that ego? What would you say to officers or supervisors out there that maybe have some of those officers that have that file like you had, and so before they end up in a jail cell, they can help alter their course, or help them take that mask off, give them some tools?
Sure. So here's the theory, right? And this is what I studied. What I did was during my doctoral program, I wanted to answer the question: what factors prevent police officers from seeking mental health assistance when they start feeling burnt out or stressed? And the biggest factor was the distrust that they had for their administrators. They did not trust their administration, therefore they did not want to ask for help because they were going to be rendered unfit for duty. Now, here's the thing. In my basic law enforcement training, they prepared me to take a life. They prepared me to use force. They prepared me to address people who needed to be arrested, but they were resistant, and high-speed chases and all that stuff, right? And so I had to be prepared to take a life. But they did not arm me with the ability to debrief. They did not arm me with the psychological constructs on how to keep myself together whenever I just witnessed a decapitation or some crazy ass call, or I almost had my life taken, or I had to take somebody's life. They don't prepare you for that aspect of it. So they got all these hours devoted to this stuff, but probably this much devoted to mental health education. And so my theory, right, because I passed the psychological exam with all my crazy shit. So did Chauvin, and so did everybody else that did some dumb shit. They all passed the psychological exam, but yet, how did that come in? Everybody wants to say, oh, they deteriorated after they were in the... No, they brought some of that shit in. They brought it in from wherever they were, because I know that I did. And Same. I answered these exams or these questions in a socially desirable way. Because again, I didn't want to be considered that guy that wasn't adequate or fit to do the job, right? So if we complement the assessment, and I've been writing about this and advocating for it, if we complement these assessments, psychological assessments, with counseling, with a skilled counselor who understands the culture of law enforcement, because ultimately I became that loose cannon, if you will, or that portfolio, because of the way I was brought into the profession by my FTOs. I was cultivated by a subculture of thinkers who sort of kind of found ways to legally justify why they did their job the way that they did, but yet it was morally questionable why they did it the way that they did. And so at the end of the day, the justice system cares about what's legal within the scope of your training, the law, and your policy. And if you can articulate that, you win. You get out of that situation. And these guys, being a veteran, they knew how to do that really well. And so, but that same thing, again, it betrayed me. That thinking betrayed me. And now that it betrayed me, I'm breaking the code of silence, the name of my book, to again pull the sheets off of that so that others can be educated on not to drink the Kool-Aid that wasn't made with sugar.
So what I got from that is a lot of, normalizing counseling, especially in the beginning. Yes. Give officers, before they hit the street, or even especially in that first few years when they are the most malleable by the FTOs and by what they're seeing in those first few years. I mean, It was a study, I believe it was out of New York University. I can't find the study again. I've looked for it. I saw it on LinkedIn. Somebody posted it, but I can't find it again. So I will put my
Mhm.
hand up with that one. I should have saved it. I believe it was NYU did a study on law enforcement, the traumas that they see. And it was 18 times as much trauma in the first 12 months of law enforcement as a civilian does their entire life.
True. I would agree with that.
My first day on the job went to a guy who'd been dead for 3 weeks. I mean,
Yeah.
how do you
Yeah, no doubt. Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I would agree with
4 weeks
that.
into the job went to a guy who jumped in front of a train? It's pretty
Yeah.
crazy stuff.
Heck
Um,
yeah.
so during those first few years when they're the most malleable, the most learning, it's like being a toddler in the profession. You really train them on the mental health, how to process, how to break things down, how to deal with finding somebody who's jumped in front of a train or been dead for
Right.
3 weeks, or the domestic that the missus has just been beat up, or a kid's been beat up, or whatever it is.
Right.
How to actually process it through counseling, through mental tools, how to self-talk, all those kind of things. Is that kind of what I heard? Was that correct?
Yes, spot on, spot on. We need to at least provide mental health education equivalent to the amount of time they spend in physical PT and using force and firearms training and driver's training and understanding the law. They need to have the equivalent amount of time, at least more than what they've got, of mental health education, so that that officer knows how to debrief for themselves until they can get professional help.
Yeah, no, I love that, man. I love that. All right, so Kareem, obviously you're doing some good stuff. One of the questions I do like to ask is, why do you do what you do? Like, why is it that you feel like you've been driven your entire life to be in this kind of helping status?
Yeah, great question. I think growing up, I didn't really understand what my purpose was.
Mhm.
And I'm a firm believer that I think purpose is a byproduct of the things you go through.
Yeah,
And when I say go through it, I'm talking about two versions of it. Like we go through stuff, and oftentimes you think, oh man, that's bad, like, whatever we went through. But we also made it through it, meaning to
yeah,
the other side of it. And what we learned from that travel or that stage and that process, we can now educate other people on how to navigate that thing as well, because we're all going to go through it in some way, shape, or form. I look at it like, if a caterpillar had a conversation with a butterfly, hey, how'd you do it? And the butterfly will tell that caterpillar, trust the process and just, go through the chrysalis and then you'll get here. So it's all about having a butterfly mindset and being able to now teach others how to have that same mindset in whatever way that they are inclined to master for themselves, helping them find their own voice, their own penmanship on their story.
I love that. I love that. That's such a good mission like statement, helping somebody find their own penmanship and
Right.
their own story. So, Kareem, if somebody needs to or wants to get in touch with you, wants to learn more about you, maybe wants some of your services, wants some of your help, how do they go about getting in touch?
So yes, they can reach out to us at selftalkcounseling.com or follow us on all social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook. What else is there out there? All this other stuff, man. Golly. But Self-Talk CC, I'm under that, or just look for me under Dr. Kareem Puranda on LinkedIn and Facebook as well.
Perfect.
And they can get a copy.
I'll put those links in the description down below as well for
Yeah.
that. Uh, one of the last questions I have for you, and I always ask this one, is what would you say your top tip to self happiness is, Kareem?
Mm. Letting go of expectations
Ooh,
around the things you cannot control. Letting go of expectations associated with things you cannot control. That's people, places, and anything that the people do in these places. Letting go of how you believe the outcome should go because you have no control over that. Sort of kind of like the weather. I can't control the weather, but I can control how I choose to dress for it. Focusing all my expectations on me, what I can control, that for me preserves my peace and my happiness.
I love that, Kareem. Well, thank you very much for today. Thanks for being here. Thanks for answering and telling us your story. Uh, any last words or anything that you wanted to say to viewers and listeners?
No, man, listen, man, it's all about making your best better. And the only way you can do that is by letting go of who you were in exchange for who you want to become. They don't have the same mindset. So you're going to have to put on the mindset of the person you want to become in order to be that. And so, full speed ahead is all I got to say to y'all, man. Full speed ahead.
Awesome, man. I love it. I love it. Well, this is another episode of Fight the Burnout. Again, if you need any assistance, if you felt like, hey, there's some stuff in here that I need to work on, either reach out to Kareem. All his details and how to get in touch with him are down in the description below, or send us an email at chris@knockingdemoncoaching.com. That comes directly to me, and we'll do our best to get you in the right hands, help you ourselves, and talk further. Again, I'll reiterate it like I said at the beginning. Take one thing from this episode and implement it. Start taking action on it. There was a lot of really good tips, tricks for supervisors, for current law enforcement, for just civilians that you can take from this episode. Make sure you share it, like it, and subscribe, and then share to somebody that you know. Just think of one person that you know that could learn something from Kareem's story and from Kareem's tips, and go from there. Till next time.
That's right.
Yep. Get the book. There we go. We'll put the link to the book down in the description down below as well. So breaking the what's it called there?
Breaking the Code of Silence, A Cop's Journey to Triumph and Truth.
There we go. So get yourself a copy of that as well, and get all the tools and tips and tricks. And we'll talk to you soon. Remember, train hard, test easy, because at the end of the day, you're always going to be tested. So may as well keep training for it.
Solid.